Good afternoon. I'm happy to introduce Father Gerry Whelan from the Gregorian University in Rome. He actually is from Dublin, but he teaches in Rome. He had spent many years in Africa and Kenya as a pastor there and working in Africa for 14 years. So we're very happy to have him come today and to speak about nonviolent peacemaking. I've known Father Gerry for a long time. We met at the Woodstock Theological Center in Washington, D.C. We both worked on the work of Father Bernard Lonergan. And one of the thoughts I had about Father Gerry, I remember he once talked about a course that he took at Boston University. And the teacher was talking about something to do with understanding. And as he was listening, he said to himself, he doesn't have it right. And it was a moment he remembered and he talked about later. And if you know anything about Abraham Maslow, he says we have these peak experiences that we remember and that form us. And I've come to the conclusion that a lot of university education is having these special moments of insight. I can remember being in Father Hollywell's class here at Seton Hall University and hearing him quote St. Augustine, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." And that was a peak experience. I still remember that class that I had here at Seton Hall University. So a lot of what Father Lonergan talks about and Father Whelan will be talking about today are remembering those special moments that form us and form our lives and make us who we are and make us who we come to be. So I'm happy to introduce Father Whelan, but I'm going to ask the Dean of the School of Diplomacy to actually do the real introduction and talk about a conference that'll be coming up in October on peacemaking. So I'm happy to introduce Professor Dean Andrea Bartoli from the School of Diplomacy.
It's beautiful to be here, and it's beautiful to share a few words before Professor Whelan, Father Whelan, will speak. Monsignor Lidi facilitated many conversations. Many of us are here because of those conversations. And one of the last conversations is inviting Father Whelan to take on, or at least address or engage with a project that some of us are exploring around Magisterium Pacis. All popes after Leo XIII have been very consistently advocating for peace in very difficult circumstances. Millions of people were killed in World War I, World War II, in the war in Iraq, in Afghanistan. But the Catholic popes have been very consistent in being against those wars. And they were not against something, they were for something. They had an idea of how human order comes about and why ordering in love is actually a responsibility of each of us, something we cannot delegate to someone else. So I suggested to Dick that in consideration of Cardinal Turkson availability of coming, the Catholic Nonviolent Initiative work that was done prior, Seton Hall could embark in a 3-year project that will engage Pope Francis, Benedict, and John Paul II in conversations so that we can hear what these popes have to say, not just as an exercise of learning, but also of encountering ourselves and why we hear sometimes and sometimes we don't. In Scripture, it's very, very clear that the Lord has a lot to say about the human capacity not to hear what is clearly stated. And it's clearly a capacity that we have in our own heart. And the two examples that Monsignor Lidi just shared are very interesting, because he was mentioning one reaction of Father Whelan to say, I don't think that he's got it right, and his reaction to Augustine given by a professor, because one was an assent, I agree with you, Augustine is speaking about me, I am restless until I am in God. And the other one is, I am hearing what this professor is saying so precisely that I'm actually questioning what the professor is saying, and I think he's wrong, he doesn't have it right. So he's exercising a very different form of listening. But I think that this is the beauty of the university, is that we encounter continuously this responsibility of thinking, this responsibility of assenting, this responsibility of deciding, is this true or not? Is this good or not? Is this important or not? Is this relevant or not? And our decisions is actually fundamental and constitutive. So I'm very delighted that I am with you listening to this nonviolent peacemaking lecture that clearly comes from a long trajectory in conversation with Bernard Lonergan and Robert Doran, and invites us into a future that must be more attentive in listening and understanding. I am delighted to be here, thankful to Monsignor Lidi, thankful to Father Whelan, and I'll give him the floor. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a great honour to be here. I've been to Seton Hall a few times before. My brother lived in Chatham until recently and has moved with his family down to Houston. Father Lidi is correct in saying we both studied Lonergan, but the fact is I studied Father Lidi, Monsignor Lidi, on Lonergan. When we met in Woodstock in '95, I think, I was thrilled to see that Monsignor Lidi was there, because I had used him a great deal in my doctorate, a biographical study of Lonergan in a number of respects. Also, Monsignor Bartoli, I have known and respected highly from appearing at Lonergan conferences, first of all, but also I know the San Egidio community a little bit in Italy, with which Professor Bartoli is concerned. And I lived for 14 years in Africa, and I knew the good work the San Egidio community had done in some remarkable peacemaking in Mozambique and Sudan, for example. And to hear that somebody was making links to Lonergan from that San Egidio experience was very exciting for me. So it's an honour to be here. And I will continue now with an introduction. I've already heard about this. I was delighted to be invited into doing something propedeutic for this October conference that will start the 3-year process that Professor Bartoli is talking about. So a description of the conference that stuck, a sentence of the description that stuck in my mind. Individuals need to embody the vocation of peace of peace in their personal lives and the various communities to which they belong. So there's this kind of paradox. You're talking about global affairs, not least war and peace, and you're talking about your own interiority at the same time. So that's especially what I note in that comment. I've already put on the title that I want to make a contribution explaining in general terms how Lonergan's epistemological and methodological thought is relevant to this. But others are working on that as well. I don't know if you've seen this book. Professor Bartoli says that he advertises it. Transforming Conflict Through Insight, Kenneth Melchin and Cheryl Pickard. So I'll arrive at that point at a certain stage of my talk. So I highly recommend it. It's terribly impressive. It's a subgenre within Lonergan studies to engage with conflict resolution. If there's a particular addition I want to make in this talk, it is to notice that a fellow called Robert Doran, who was actually my doctoral director in Toronto, a Jesuit of a younger generation than Lonergan from Wisconsin, adds something to Lonergan, in my opinion, even at a fundamental epistemological level, that is relevant all the more so for peacemaking. That is a notion of psychic conversion. Some of you who've studied a bit of Lonergan perhaps might have heard that Lonergan speaks about religious conversion, moral conversion, intellectual conversion. And now Doran adds a notion of psychic conversion that I accept and I use, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Now this is actually the email that Monsignor Liddy sent me. I was all set to give a talk on a much more easy topic for me that I have given before, and Monsignor starts to constrain me to try to feed into this process that is already present in Seton Hall. So let's just notice something of his very perspicacious comments on what I had been telling him about what I'm already studying these days and how it connected to this peacemaking topic. The notion of psychic conversion and symbols as a way of getting concrete conversions to peacemaking, even in universities where there's a lot of fighting. Anything Pope Francis has said about this, question mark, using Lonergan's notion of conversion in general to illuminate peacemaking on the personal and political level. So it was Monsignor Liddy who really prompted me to formulate my topic for this talk. I have a book coming on Pope Francis and Lonergan that is implicit in what Monsignor Liddy was saying, but not really Pope Francis and Doran. The book wasn't long enough for me to get on to Doran. So in truth, I won't be saying much about Pope Francis. The question time, you're most welcome. There's all sorts of connections. I'm very enthusiastic about these links, but I understand a number of students will be leaving for another class at 5 p.m. I expect to take about 35 more minutes. So I'll do the talking, and then I'll be staying around for any length of questions that people want. We could get on to the Pope Francis link perhaps in question time, but not really in my main talk. So I hope you'll forgive me if I talk quite a bit about myself now. I can at least invoke Monsignor Liddy, who does something similar. If we're talking about interiority, and just this sort of paradoxical link between the individual conversion of a person and the significance for historical change that that person in community can then be part of, I think it's appropriate that individuals do a little bit of almost a St. Augustine of Hippo autobiography account. The point is, of course, I'm making a point about what is psychic conversion, how it adds to what Lonergan talks about, how it's relevant for the redemption of history, as I'll talk a bit about more. But if you'll permit me, still in an introductory mode really, talk about my own experience and ultimately, therefore, what psychic conversion has meant in my life. When I was your age, you undergraduates here, I was studying economics in Trinity College in Dublin. I was hanging on to my Catholic faith more or less. I knew I had to go to a certain kind of youth mass that was on a Sunday night if I was going to hang on to my faith, because I found a lot of other masses not helpful. But I was also able to acknowledge to myself I was mostly lazy, so tried to keep going. After one of these masses, there was a talk from a lady that I wouldn't usually listen to, frankly, of a certain age, who spoke about the organisation called Pax Christi, which is an organisation of active non-violence. I was very touched by it. She talked about the nuclear Cold War, political lobbying done by Pax Christi. But mostly she talked about prayer and how we have to be individuals of peace reconciled with ourselves and our own demons, if we are ever to be able to proceed in a peacemaking way, and how you can be proposing the right policy, but doing it in such a way that you're almost contradicting yourself. So there's a method of peacemaking where the medium is the message. She was saying that you have to incarnate in some way the kind of message of peace that you're trying to communicate in specifics, in its social manifestation, policy kind of manifestation. So I was very touched by this. I joined up. I remember it cost me £10, which didn't come easy those days, the 70s. Next step was joining the Jesuits after noviceship. I'm really grateful to the formation that the Jesuits gave me. I had 10 more years before they let me loose on anybody as an ordained priest. 2 years of noviceship. So the spiritual exercises, the 30-day retreat you've probably heard about. Again, there's this sense of zeal for action in the world and caution about, am I wise enough to do anything? So there's a call to humility, an interior examination of motives as you're very active in the world and concerned for the poor, concerned for society. So again, this paradox. Just on the humility, see, I don't want to confess all my sins in public, but I remember there's a prayer called the Kingdom, Prayer of the Kingdom, in the spiritual exercises. It's Luke 4. You just imagine yourself in the scene of Luke 4. Jesus coming to Nazareth saying, I have come to bring good news to the poor, bring liberty to captives, sight to the blind. And you're asked to ask, do you buy this? Do you sign up for this project? And I remember feeling an enormous amount of zeal that I did want to be a Jesuit and commit myself to this sort of project. Shortly afterwards, I'm imagining Jesus in different gospel scenes. And I'm getting preaching and healing. And I'm getting really annoyed that everybody's paying attention to him and not to me. And I suddenly realised that I don't like this. And this has never been my life up to now. That I have always been seeking to do good things with myself at the centre and myself getting praised and thanked as a result. So it won't surprise you that it was off to psychotherapy for me. So in fact, we couldn't all have been crazy because all the novices did psychotherapy in the second year of noviceship. It was a remarkable experience of staying in the spirit of the spiritual exercises and in a sense praying them more deeply than we had even during the 30 days. I came, again, here is where I don't want to confess all my sins, but confronting some behaviours that, it's not just it was getting me into trouble with the novice master, it was irritating the living daylights out of my fellow novices. There were certain patterns of behaviour that I had to acknowledge were really not good. And then with therapy, passing this scary bridge of recognising that, look, I had rationalisations for what I had been doing. But my actual motives for what I had been doing were unknown to me. So I had unconscious motivations. I've already mentioned, for example, seeking attention. There were others. I had behaviours being driven more by unconscious motivations than I had been acknowledging up to that date. I don't know if any of you have done therapy. This is very important to what I'm explaining about psychic conversion. The moment of fear that you can experience when you suddenly realise you're not as much in control of your own actions as you thought you were. That I employ masking narratives for my behaviour that disguise some of the real motives. And then exploring some of those motives and recognising hurts from the past. There are aspects of my behaviour that are inauthentic and they come from a woundedness. So I need somehow to visit the sources of that woundedness. So like the story has a happy ending, so to speak, but I want to emphasise the moment of fear that when you're in the middle of just opening the window to the fact that there's stuff down there influencing me. And if I've spotted one of my motives that needs working on, what more will there be? What what rock do I have for my self-identity? Here it was very helpful for having done the spiritual exercises, because I had actually had a very strong experience of God's unconditional love. So to take the risk in prayer of saying, look, I let God's unconditional love into this area. And of course it remains unconscious to a considerable degree, but I was praying in a more real way in the second year of the novitiate than I'd ever done in my life before. And it had to do with this therapeutic insight that there are realms of my motivation that are unconscious to me and are doing me no good. So unconscious motivation to authenticity. So this just briefly anticipating what I'll be saying in a more explanatory way later in the talk. Unconscious motivation and authentic self-transcendence. So Bob Doran says that psychic conversion is the process that I more or less can understand from my novitiate experience. You know, we're all a bit hesitant to say I'm completely religiously converted, morally converted, intellectually, psychically. But I understood what he was saying by saying that psychic conversion involves finding ways to help the unconscious cooperate with my authentic self-transcendence. And then to notice two things about this. I've only spoken so far about the way that the unconscious can block my authentic self-transcendence. But there's another area which was central to the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. Discernment of spirits, you've probably heard about. How am I feeling as in an active life? I'm aware that I'm subject to both the consolation that comes from the Holy Spirit, the desolation that comes from the enemy of human nature. And the real clincher for discernment of spirits is it's towards decision making. I will recognize that when I'm in a state of consolation, confirmed by my spiritual director, I can make decisions that are in keeping with the will of God. Now, we're not talking about sinning, not sinning. We're talking about the whole realm of what am I going to do with my life. Ignatius calls it the election. So discernment of spirits, to start with, concerns election of a way of life. I'm going to get married. I'm going to be a doctor, a lawyer. I'm going to join the Jesuits. There's no saying, there's no rules about that. There's a whole area of, it's kind of an aesthetic choice. What just seems more beautiful to me to make of myself? My sister told me about being proposed marriage by her boyfriend, really not being sure, knowing all his defects. And she tells us all on a regular basis what they are. But having a dream in the night and waking up certain that he was the one. And they've got 8 grandchildren now, the two of them. So that was her. You know, who's to say who you marry? Who's to say what career you choose? It's got something to do with the unconscious. It wells up in your affectivity. There's this whole way in which the unconscious can be freed from being an obstacle to your self-transcendence to being a positive resource. If you've heard of Rosemary Houghton, a spirituality theology writer, has written a book called The Passionateness of Being that Lonergan liked a great deal. And I believe that notion of the passionateness of being is a reference really to the way the unconscious can be mobilized as well as the conscious aspects of self-transcendence to direct a life. Okay, I'm going back then to my academic training. So in a sense I've explained a little bit of the essence in some ways of what I'm trying to do here today, which is psychic conversion based on my personal account. And of course the point is to invite you to think similar thoughts. But I'm heading towards a more technical explanation of Lonergan's thought and Doran's thought and its relevance for peacemaking now. So as I went into academic formation, I was using my background in economics. I was very motivated to work for the poor and to go to Africa, in fact, where I did go for 14 years. But this experience I'd had in formation in the novitiate made me just a little bit cautious that not everything that glitters is gold, so to speak, even in social justice ministry. And I became a little bit cautious about quite a few of my fellow Jesuits. And I would hazard to say, in some of the general tone of the way the Society of Jesus was in the 1970s and 1980s. A certain immature step towards how to link faith and justice, as they said. That there was something more to be understood and embraced here. Just quite unkindly, the way I put it myself, was coming out of the noviceship. I'd see some Jesuits active, especially in the social justice ministry, and I'd say they should go back to the noviceship. They should go back to my novice master. I can see in them some of, for example, the attention seeking that I was involved in. So a caution that is a discerning caution about even work such as Option for the Poor, the most noble, working for others. So that's good old Karl Marx there, you see. I think implicitly, without meaning to, there was a slipping into a certain Marxist kind of thinking for quite a lot of people that wanted to transform society. Conversely, these were the years of Pope John Paul II, the Solidarity movement, and the clarity of that Pope John Paul had, that Wojtyla had as a philosopher, about conflictual change over against the communists in Poland, always by peaceful methods. So he had developed a whole philosophy to support that. It's why he was so quick-footed as Pope to say yes to solidarity the moment it had its first strike. You know, Lech Walesa, the solidarity movement. Before many of you were born, I understand now, but it was exciting at times for me. Active non-violence, a different way to change that is not Marxist, and clearly was not Marxist when it was in Poland that was opposing communism. Now, there's a 2-semester course here that I'm not going to really get into, but in my academic work I became aware of continuity with the Pax Christi organisation that I had known, that there is a discipline of active non-violence that is taught, and I don't know, perhaps it is taught here, I hope so, in Seton Hall. This wasn't the central line of my studies. I would specialise in Lonergan, but I was aware here of so this whole list: Daniel O'Connell of Ireland, Henry David Thoreau, I hope you know him quite well, civil disobedience, both literature but very much this active non-violent philosophy for how do you change an unjust state in a democratic state where you want to observe the rules of the democratic state, sort of, even if you're put into jail for active non-violent protest, but it's within democracy. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. I don't know if you've heard of the Philippine People Power Revolution that overthrew General Marcos in 1986. And the point was, there was a self-aware method that they were trained in, how not to be violent with the police, even if they're knocking you on the head when you're making a peaceful protest, this kind of thing. Daniel O'Connell, the Irishman, I was delighted to hear, is a sort of founder figure. Just one comment on him. He witnessed the effects of the French Revolution. He was an Irish nationalist around late 1700s, of a fairly rich Irish family as Catholics go. But so very committed to work for independence of Ireland from Britain, very aware of many injustices. The 1700s were a rough century for Catholics in Britain and Ireland. But he was taken aback by seeing the consequences of violence after the French Revolution, especially, in fact, in Napoleon. So from scratch, in some ways, he determined to adopt a method that would employ the instruments of British democracy. While there was all sorts of distortions in elections, it was still possible to get Irish members of Parliament elected, who would then try to block the business of Parliament unless concessions were made to the Irish independence movement. Anyway, that's just a little bit of kind of self-advertising as an Irishman. So now I move along to my African years. I'll talk more about some of my academic formation as I talk about Lonergan, but I found myself not only studying in Africa, but not only teaching full-time theology, but for a period being assigned as pastor to a poor parish in Nairobi. That's a photograph of it when Pope Francis visited. It's the one Jesuit parish in Nairobi. It's in the slums, and he met with representatives of all the slum parishes in Nairobi to give a talk there Of course, I was gone for 6 years, so I missed the whole event. But happy 6 years I was there. I want to talk about two experiences of active non-violence as a pastor of a parish with which I was directly involved. Well, first of all, a prelude to that. There was a certain organisation of priests from the poor parishes of Nairobi, the periphery, as Pope Francis says. They brought over people from the Philippines who had been involved in the active non-violent overthrow of Marcos. It won't surprise you to hear they were shadowed by the Kenyan secret police for all of their 2 weeks in Kenya. But they gave us quite a specific training in active non-violence methods, and especially the history of what had happened in the Philippines. Very happy event. It really was active non-violence. But anyway, you never know what's going to happen in parish life from week to week. But it was in the background, this kind of method of active non-violence that we had been trained in. One event emerged where we're mostly a poor area, but up on a hill there is a very rich housing estate, which technically was part of our parish. A great proportion of people there were Catholics because they'd been educated in the Catholic schools, which were the best schools in Kenya. None of them came to parish in our church. They went in their cars to a middle-class parish down the road. The road was a big motorway that led west out of Nairobi. A large number of the population in the slum area had to walk through the rich area to get to the road. The organising committee, the residence committee, started putting up gates to make a gated community out of their housing estate. And so we made inquiries. There was no legality whatsoever in what they did. If I committed violence here, it was violence against some iron posts. We were instructed by lawyers to take down whatever they built because it wasn't legal. So we also were quite involved in ecumenism. There were a lot of Anglicans in the area, so it was with the Anglican ministers that we started to try to open dialogue with the residence committee. And it was quite remarkable. There was one guy there who was a junior minister of government who threatened us with violence, that he could send in thugs if he wanted. But we kept the process going. Next, a very, very sad, tragic event happened. There were security guards outside each gate. There were a crowd of delinquents from down in the slum who I think had been throwing stones at the security guards. Meanwhile, the son of the chairman of the pastoral council of the Anglican parish was walking back from school, and the security guards were chasing in anger the guys that were running away. Saw this fellow in his school uniform, the others had not been in a school uniform, and beat him to death. So now the Anglicans were up in arms, and the funeral of the boy occurred. And the father stood at the graveside and appealed to the people not to commit any violence. That this is not Christianity, that you've got to somehow respond, returning good for evil. The residence committee heard about this, and they cooled down their position in the negotiations with us. We found a way to agree, in fact, that all they needed to do was block cars that were coming through. It was really thieves coming through in automobiles that were the problem. So pedestrians could go through in the end. So I'll just leave it at that as an example. There were other examples where I was more personally involved in trying to remember to be Christ-like in positions of conflict and aware that transformation can happen. There can be a moral transformation when you have entered into conflict in the right way on the part of an oppressor, which is what we were confronting on certain occasions. The Bernard Lonergan. So this is, I'm aware of time and I know people have to go. I'm only arriving at the very technical philosophy, theology now, but I've covered the basis, basically, of what I'll be explaining in a more academic, methodological way now. Bernard Lonergan was deeply affected by the economic crash of 1929. So he was that age, he was from Canada, already a Jesuit. Had studied philosophy, very brilliant, attracted to cognitional theory to the questions of how do we know anything. He recognised that was very important. But at an affective level, between philosophy and theology, he was brought back from England, where he did his philosophy, and worked in his home area of Montreal, and saw friends of his parents queuing at soup kitchens because they were unemployed and hungry. He was scandalised by this. He would soon later go for studies in the Gregorian University, where I teach, in Rome, and witness the rise of Mussolini. So he had economic depression, the rise of fascism, and he felt very committed to try to help society out of this. There is a crisis of civilization that is evident. Now, being the kind of intellectual that he was, he said, this has intellectual roots. For example, I'm convinced, he said, that there were economic mistakes made at the level of theory that influenced government decisions, that made the depression a depression in 1929 instead of a recession. Similarly, there's a philosophy of the human person at work in Nazism, in Italian fascism, that's not so very different from the communists in the other side of what would later be the Iron Curtain. The state is more important than the individual. That there is good we're trying to do. It might, in the case of Nazis, just be for the Aryan people, but basically we will, to say the least, break eggs to make the omelette. That the dignity of the individual did not have a place, and there's also a sort of utopia here. We're trying to solve everything here in this life. We're going to attain a perfect society at all costs, but it's the state that will do it, under the control of an elite that knows better than everybody else. So he started working on economics and especially a philosophy of history. As he would write in his book Insight, which is his work of his maturity later, if you're going to try to intelligently direct history, you have to have an adequate theory of history. You have to have an adequate social analysis, as some people would say later, and theological analysis, in fact, of the situation, and a set of intellectual instruments that can help produce kinds of solutions that are necessary in any given situation. So now I'm really jumping fast here on the academic front. Lonergan, quite young, while he was still before ordination, said, I want to devote my life to developing a philosophy of history. And I don't have time to explain this at great length. He would write just two masterworks in his life, an 800-page book called Insight, and a shorter book called Method in Theology. But I'd like to explain by this diagram. I just kind of made this up, but it's my best way of explaining what's at the heart of his thinking. But I hope I've already explained his motivation. I call it his social concern. He talks about, he uses vector analysis. He was a gifted mathematician, amongst other things. So the analogy, the metaphor of vectors to study history. If you're studying a moving item, let's say a rocket going to the moon, the vector analysis, we remember that. I remember that, and I didn't love maths as it got up to its higher reaches. So they're a model, an idealized model of forces. You never see a vector in real life. These are theoretical instruments that you use that when combined, they produce the trajectory that you're already observing and predict its further direction. So this is, by analogy, a vectorial analysis of history. So his first principle is to say, if we imagine a situation where everybody was authentic, what would history look like? This is the imaginary vector of progress in history. Now, I've sort of put things out of order a bit. The next slide is about his basic epistemology, that we have a process of knowing that passes through experience, understanding, judgment, and decision. So, but now I'm going back just to say very briefly, the progress, if you had authentic people, would still involve a lot of change. There would be processes going on in history where science is helping technological innovation. Technology is bumping along economic change. Politics is involved with distributing the benefits of what has been produced economically. And culture gives the set of meanings and values that guide the politicians, who in turn direct the economy, especially that. So this is an idealized notion. His economic theory, which he started to work on, was based on, well, an ideal notion of how should an economy work. I won't go into details about that. Progress. It's a process. Next, vector. Inauthentic decisions. We go off the rails personally at any and all of the levels of knowing. Attentiveness, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. So, consequences in society of inauthentic decisions produce a series of decline policies. So now the reality we face is a mixture of a social reality where policies have been decided upon that are sometimes both good and bad, and we live with a hodgepodge of progress and decline in our society and in our culture as well. So there's a great need then to have a measure on what is authentic. I'll go again to the next. There should of course be an arrow there, and I just don't have the technology to draw that arrow through those 4 levels of consciousness. And then there's the need for, he talks about a cultural elite, not least emanating out of universities, who have a measure of what would be progress for society. What do we actually have? And then, I go back again, this third arrow needs a fair bit of explaining, but to start with, it is that these cultured people who are working at their own authenticity would learn to reverse decline and promote progress in history, in the history around them, in the social structures around them, but first and foremost at a cultural level. Clarify what are the meanings and values that we should be living by, and then hope that the consequences for more structured policies would follow from that. It's just that we are never authentic, is the catch. So at a philosophical level, I've been speaking about the process of doing this. So really, I'm going, where am I going? Excuse me if I'm giving you a headache with these changes of slides. Redemption comes from Jesus Christ. Lonergan is saying that he talks about moral impotence. The human race is caught, left to its own devices. Inauthenticity is stronger than authenticity. Decline is stronger than progress in history. Decline sets up vicious circles. Above all, what he calls general bias, where you attack the very instruments of intelligence that should be part of the solution. So you abuse as a nerd, as an egghead, anybody who's trying to formulate intelligent solutions at a level of culture and social structures. So he becomes a theologian at this moment and not just a philosopher. He says that it's not just a Catholic or Christian event that grace would happen, but there is a supernatural intervention in history. I see how time is going. Feel free to leave. I understand I've been warned that a number of students have to leave, so as you wish in your own time. So the redemption of history that reverses decline and promotes progress will have to come from communities of God's grace. You can talk about the ins and outs of that. The Christian church is at the heart of this, he certainly believed. United Nations, what are even the communal secular institutions that are actually channeling grace into communal reflection? Now, I come to this book. That's the title of this book. This is Lonergan applied to the subgenre of the conflict resolution. It's an excellent book. In many ways, it is, of course, an exercise in confronting the decline in society that represents violence, especially the conflicts. I think of Northern Ireland all the time, the Protestants, Catholics fighting each other, loyalists, nationalists. So very briefly, it's an invitation. First of all, this book is for training mediators. So these mediators should be part of what Lonergan calls this cultural elite of people who have self-appropriated the structure of their own authenticity and are able to try to then work with communities who will, to try to get them to a place of reconciliation and return to progress from the place of decline where they have got themselves. So the mediation process involves the dialogue of parties. And above all, it's to trace the steps you took in this process of decision-making. Where might you have gone off the rails to make a violent choice? But then also, try to get inside the head of the person that you're in conflict with. So Catholics in Northern Ireland have to try to understand the good that is in Protestants and how their historical narrative of their own lives includes occasional massacres by the Irish Catholics around them. So an empathy for the other position. And then again, I knew some specific people who worked in Northern Ireland, helping groups of Protestants and Catholics write a joint narrative that does justice to the two traditions, recognises how violence occurred, but finds a way to move forward to a new reconciled position. The amazing thing in Northern Ireland is that there was a peace agreement. Of course, we could talk more about this. So now it's 4:47, and I'm only now getting to the main point of my talk, in one sense, but I believe I've been covering it also. Robert Doran adds something to this. I've given an explanation of Lonergan's affective commitment to helping history, helping the poor who are suffering from bad economic policies, etc. But his highly theoretical move then to work on epistemology, philosophy of history. He's convinced that there has to be work at that intellectual level if real and valuable policies will be applied. It's not obvious how do you solve problems of a modern economy, for example, or for that matter, complicated political origins of fascism in the 1930s. So intelligence, the role of an academic specialist in the process of really elevating history. I've talked about that. But I want to now talk about Bob Doran in this book called Theology and the Dialectics of History. Just to add, I'm only connecting the dots now between my personal testimony that I've given and this more theoretical level. Conversion, especially intellectual conversion, to be authentic in our use of the levels of consciousness, is all very well. But what if you're like me as a novice and you have unconscious distortions leading you off the rails? A simple intellectual invitation to intellectual conversion isn't going to cut it. So what about the healing of the unconscious interference with the levels of consciousness that constitute authenticity? I wrote a book on Lonergan and Doran. You can't really see it, I think. Social Concern in Bernard Lonergan and Robert Doran. I tell kind of two intellectual biographies, the Lonergan biography, and then I suggest that Robert Doran is in continuity with Lonergan, a fellow Jesuit, a kind of anointed son by Bernard Lonergan. He became the curator of the legacy of Lonergan for publishing the collected works of Lonergan. As a fellow Jesuit, he did this under obedience or with the permission of Jesuit superiors. But there is this expansion of the notion of psychic conversion that becomes crucial to helping authenticity happen, and even to the theory of history. There's an expansion of the theory of progress, decline and redemption that comes from Doran's edition. So I want to just briefly mention this. I don't know if you know this painting, Salvador Dali, The Christ of John of the Cross. It's actually in Glasgow. I got permission to use it on the front cover of my book. It's really more about resurrection than it is about crucifixion. You know, we're lucky there isn't a hippopotamus upside down in this painting, being that it comes from Salvador Dali. This is his very Christian Catholic phase at the end of his life. But it's really about the value of the cross breathing life onto history. If you see there's a lake and a boat there, in truth it's Galilee. It's John 21, the resurrection scene to the disciples after fishing all night. But I understand it also to be the crucified and risen Christ hovering over the course of history, redeeming it. And that's already Bernard Lonergan. He talks about the law of the cross as a distinct theme that comes from the theological tradition, where we become Christ-like, that on the cross Jesus returns good for evil and becomes a model for us to do the same thing. But what I want to talk about is that with Doran's greater psychoanalytical background, he gets inside the dynamics of how the cross saves us as a symbol, and even how, as messengers of the cross, we become cooperators in the redemption of history. In brief, he talks about how victimization occurs in our youth. Sexual abuse is in the environment these days, so we're not far from these issues here. But we're all actually harmed from our youth, even if the sexually abused is the most extreme case. So we have defense mechanisms. The only cure for the woundedness that we feel is unconditional love. But we set up defense mechanisms because we're just too afraid of taking the risk that we might be healed and then let down. We find it impossible to accept the sincerity of the person offering us unconditional love, up to the point where we're capable of committing violence because we have so defended ourselves to reject the person that is offering unconditional love to us. I invite you to think, this is a dream kind of analysis. This is a symbolic discourse I'm now involved with that Bob Doran gives. Imagine you're the good thief crucified beside Jesus. You have been in this compulsive bad behaviour and you've got your just rewards. Along comes Jesus and you say, truly this is a good man and he's definitely dying. Now I can accept there is an offer of unconditional love here that is not insincere. The switch gospel, Mark, the centurion at the foot of the cross, truly this was a just man. So the image of the cross as the unconditional love up to the end, whereby it accepts the rejection that we who are too hurt to accept it apply to it. However, there's one even worse bit of news. I invite you to imagine that we are also the soldiers who hit the nails into the hands of Christ. It's not all victimization or misbehavior. There is sin in the world and we participate in it. So symbolically, we are both the soldier that hammers the nail into Christ's hands and the good thief who is promised, today you will be in paradise with me. So, and this all is made understandable by the resurrection. So it's the resurrection of Christ that helps us make meaning of suffering and equips us then to become what somebody called the wounded healer. There's this paradox whereby we're not perfect overnight, but there's a process that we who are wounded are nevertheless significantly in a process of healing. And we have this paradoxical deep desire to spot other people who are up to the same funny business that we have been until recently, violent and otherwise. So who spoke about the wounded healer? No. Of course, he wrote a book of that title, but who spoke first? Who was Henry Nouwen quoting? It's Carl Jung. Carl Jung coined the term, and Henry Nouwen, who's, well, our generation, with due respect, immediately recognised the book, The Wounded Healer, a masterpiece of spiritual writing. Bob Doran uses Jung a great deal. But anyway, I could almost finish now. You see what I'm getting at? The complementing this more strictly Lonergan view, slightly rational, understand the person you're in conflict with, etc. There's all sorts of room to move from a notion of psychic conversion to a sense of being wounded healers, being able to negotiate symbols that inhabit people in conflict. In a certain sense, the way I've just been talking symbolically about how do you work with the cross as a symbol that motivates us. So attending to the psyche, to feelings and dreams, clear up blockages to self-transcendence, passionateness of being, an aesthetic discernment of life choices, applied, however, to the process of active non-violence. And I'm really not going into further detail because I haven't done the work. But there would be, a second book to be written, expanding what's here, I think, with the insights that come from psychic conversion. For example, treating what is the symbol system that inhabits the mind of the people in conflict. It's not just where did I make mistakes of judgment and decision. It's also how do I need to adopt new symbols, different symbols, as motivating me. So healing only occurs with grace. I want to go back to that point. It can't be only secular. Now, we're all in favour of the social doctrine of the church, etc. We're not talking about grace as exclusive to the Christianity or to the Catholic Church, but we believe nonetheless something that most other people wouldn't know, which is, in fact, what's happening is that they are being graced in some way, mysterious way, participating in the cross and resurrection of Christ whenever they are capable of reconciling and returning decline to progress. Unconditional love and self-sacrifice, Christ, the perfect scapegoat. Those of you that have some philosophical background will recognise no small amount of René Girard in the account that Doran makes of this. So that's it. Thank you very much. We've already seen our students go away, but I'll be staying for questions.